Unsurprisingly, Egwene nodded acceptance without making the offer again. Even with this past month of hard recruiting behind her, Gareth Bryn still had no more than half the soldiers he had told her would be needed to take Tar Valon. According to Egwene, he was ready to begin with what he had, but clearly it troubled her. I have hard decisions to make, Elaine. The wheel weaves as the wheel wills, but it is still me who has to decide. Impulsively, Elaine waded through the snow and threw her arms around Egwene to hug her. At least, she started out wading. As she clasped the other woman to her, the snow vanished, leaving not so much as a damp spot on their dresses. The two of them staggered as if dancing with one another and almost fell. I know you will make the right decision, Elaine said, laughing in spite of herself. Egwene did not join her laughter. I hope so, she said gravely, because whatever I decide, people are going to die for it. She patted Elaine's arm. Well, you understand that sort of decision, don't you? We both need to be back in our beds. She hesitated before going on. Elaine.
Hey, OG,
if
how you
Rand
doing,
comes
brother?
to you again, you must let me know what he says, whether he gives you any clue what he means to do or where he means to go. I will tell you whatever I can, Egwene. Elaine felt a stab of guilt. She had told Egwene everything, almost everything, but not that she had bonded Rand with Min and Aviendha. Tower law did not prohibit what they had done. Very careful questioning of Randine had made that much clear. But whether it would be permitted was not clear at all. Still, as she had heard an Arafellan mercenary recruited by Brigitte say, what was not forbidden was allowed. That sounded almost like one of Lenie's old sayings, though she doubted her nurse would ever have been so permissive. You're troubled by him, Egwene. More than usual, I mean. I can tell. Why? I have reason to be, Elaine. The Eisenbeards report very troubling rumors. Only rumors,
Yeah, this one might be a kind of a short live. I'm actually a little tired tonight.
Now. A short, slender young woman who seemed strong as steel and tall as a mountain. Determination filled her dark eyes and set her jaw. I know you love him. I love him too. But I'm not trying to heal the White Tower just so he can chain Aes Sedai like Damani. Sleep well and have pleasant dreams, Elaine. Pleasant dreams are more valuable than people realize. And with that, she was gone, back to the waking world. For a moment, Elaine stood staring at the spotlight.
Oh yeah, it's always good when you get good smoke.
What had she been talking about? Rand would never do that. If only for love of her, he would not. She prodded that rock-hard knot in the back of her head. With him so far away, the veins of gold shone only in memory. Surely he would not. Troubled in herself, she stepped out of the dream, back to her sleeping body. She needed sleep, but no sooner was she back in her own body than sunlight fell on her eyelids. What hour was it? She had appointments to keep, duties to carry out. She wanted to sleep for months. She wrestled with duty, but duty won. She had a busy day ahead. Every day was a busy day. Her eyes popped open, feeling grainy as if she had not slept at all. By the slant of light through the windows, it was well beyond sunrise. She could simply lie there. Duty. Aviendha shifted in her sleep, and Elaine poked her sharply in the ribs. If she had to be awake, then Aviendha was not going to loll about. Aviendha woke with a start, stretching for her knife lying atop the small table on her side of the bed. Before her hand touched the dark horn hilt, she let it fall. Something woke me, she muttered. I thought a shadow was... Look at the sun! Why did you let me sleep so late? She demanded, scrambling from the bed. Just because I'm allowed to stay with you. The words were muffled for an instant as she jerked her sleep-wrinkled shift off over her head. There's not me, Mona Ella won't switch me if she thinks I'm being lazy. Do you mean to lie there all day?
That's one way to do it.
With a groan, Elaine climbed out of the bed. Esanda was already waiting at the door to the dressing room. She never waked Elaine unless Elaine remembered to order it. Elaine surrendered herself to the white-haired woman's almost silent administrations, while Aviendha
that's when you just call it a little salad bowl.
But her sister made up for Esanda's quiet with a laughing string of comments along the line of how having someone else put your clothes on you must feel like
sometimes that
being
works
baby
out
again,
for the good.
and how Elaine might forget how to put on her own clothes and need somebody to dress her. She had done very much the same every morning since they had begun to share the same bed. Avienda found it very funny. Elaine did not say a word, except to answer her tirewoman's suggestions on what she should wear, until the last mother-of-pearl button was done up and she stood examining herself in the stand mirror. "Asanda," she said then, casually, "are Avienda's clothes ready?" The fine blue wool with the little silver embroidery would do well enough for what she faced today.
At least it's,
Asanda brightened.
you get to say out some
Lady
runs.
Avienda's pretty silks and laces, my lady? Oh, yes, all brushed and cleaned and ironed.
Then when they
and
ask
put
you
away.
what kind, you say,
She
oh, there's a
gestured
couple
to the
different
wardrobes
ones.
lining one wall. Elaine smiled over her shoulder at her sister. Avienda stared at the wardrobes as though they contained vipers, then gulped and hastily finished winding the dark folded kerchief around her head. When Elaine had dismissed Asanda, she said, "Just in case you need them." "Very well," Avienda muttered, putting on her silver necklace. "No more jokes about the woman dressing you." "Good, or I'll tell her to start dressing you. Now that would be amusing." Grumbling under her breath about people who could not take a joke, Avienda plainly did not agree. Elaine half expected her to demand that all the clothes she had acquired be discarded. She was a little surprised Avienda had not seen to it already. For Avienda, the breakfast laid out in the sitting room consisted of cured ham with raisins, eggs cooked with dried plums, dried fish prepared with pine nuts, fresh bread slathered with butter, and tea made syrupy with honey. Well, not actually syrupy, but it seemed so. Elaine got no butter on her bread, very little honey in her tea, and instead of the rest, a hot porridge of grains and herbs that was supposed to be especially healthy. She did not feel with child, no matter what Min had told Avienda, but Min had told Brigitte, too, once the three of them began getting drunk. Between her warder, Dylan, and Rena Harfor, she now found herself limited to a diet suitable for a woman in her condition. If she sent to the kitchens for a treat, somehow it never arrived, and if she slipped down there herself, the cooks gave her such glum, disapproving stares that she slipped back out again with nothing. She did not really mourn the spiced wine and sweets and the other things she was no longer allowed. Not that much, anyway, except when Avienda was gobbling tarts or puddings. But everyone in the palace knew she was pregnant. And, of course, that meant they knew how she had gotten that way, if not with whom. The men were not too bad, beyond the fact that they knew, and she knew they knew, but the women did not bother to hide knowing. Whether they accepted or deprecated the situation, half looked at her as though she were a hoyden, and the other half with speculation. Forcing herself to swallow the porridge, it was not that bad, really, but she dearly would have loved some of the ham Avienda was slicing, or a little of the egg with plums. Spooning lumpy porridge into her mouth, she almost looked forward to the start of birthing sickness so she could share the queasy belly with Brigitte. The first visitor to enter her apartments that morning beside Asanda was the leading candidate among the palace women for the father of her barely quickened child. "My queen," Captain Mellar said, sweeping off his plumed hat in a flourishing bow, "the chief clerk awaits your majesty's pleasure." The captain's dark, unblinking eyes said he would never have dreams of the men he killed, and the lace-edged sash across his chest and the lace at his neck and wrists only made him look harder. Wiping grease from her chin with a linen napkin, Avienda watched him with no expression on her face. The two guardswomen, standing one on either side of the doors, grimaced faintly. Mellar already had a reputation for pinching guardswomen's bottoms, the prettier ones at least, not to mention disparaging their abilities in the city's taverns. The second was far worse, in the guardswomen's eyes. "I am not a queen yet, Captain," Elaine said briskly. She always tried to keep as much to the point as possible with the man. "How is recruiting for my bodyguard coming along?" "Only 32 so far, my lady." Still holding his hat, the hatchet-faced man rested both hands on his sword hilt, his lounging posture hardly suitable for the presence of one he had called his queen. Nor was his grin. "Lady Brigitte has exacting standards. Not many women can match them. Give me 10 days, and I can find 100 men who'll better them and hold you as dear in their hearts as I do." I think not, Captain Mellar. It was an effort to keep a chill out of her voice. He had to have heard the rumors concerning himself and her. Could he think that just because she had not denied them, she might actually find him attractive? Pushing away the half-empty porridge bowl, she suppressed a shudder. 32 so far? The numbers were growing quickly. Some of the hunters for the Horn who had been demanding rank had decided that serving in Elaine's bodyguard carried a certain flair. She conceded that the women could not all be on duty day and night, but no matter what Brigitte said, the goal of 100 seemed excessive. The woman dug in her heels now at any suggestion of fewer, though. Please tell the chief clerk he can come in, she told him. He swept her another elaborate bow. She rose to follow him, and as he pulled one of the lion-carved doors open, she laid a hand on his arm and smiled. Thank you again for saving my life, Captain, she said, this time warm enough for a caress. The fellow smirked at her. The guardswomen stared straight ahead, frozen, those she could see out in the hall before the doors closed behind him, as well as those inside. And when Elaine turned around, Avienda was staring at her with little more expression than she'd shown Mellar. That little was pure amazement, though, Elaine sighed. Crossing the carpets, she bent to put an arm around her sister and spoke softly, for her ear alone. She trusted the women of her bodyguard with things she told very few others, but there were some matters she dared not trust them. I saw a maid pass in Avienda. Maids gossip worse than men. The more who think this child is Doylan Mellar's, the safer it will be. If necessary, I'll let the man pinch my bottom. I see, Avienda said slowly, and frowned into her plate, as though seeing something other than the eggs and plums she began pushing around with her spoon. Master Norrie presented his usual blend of mundane maintenance of the palace and the city, tidbits from his correspondence in foreign capitals, and information gleaned from merchants and bankers and others who had dealings beyond the borders. But his first piece of news was by far the most important to her, if not the most interesting. The two most prominent bankers in the city are amenable, my lady, he said in that dry-as-dust voice of his. Clutching his leather folder to his narrow chest, he eyed Avienda sideways. He was still not accustomed to her presence while he made his reports. Or the guardswomen. Avienda bared her teeth at him, and he blinked, then coughed into a bony hand. Master Hoffley and Mistress Andscale were somewhat hesitant at first, but they know the market for alum as well as I. It would not be safe to say that their coffers are now yours, but I have arranged for 20,000 gold crowns to be moved to the palace strong room, and more will come as needed. Inform the Lady Brigitte, Elaine told him, hiding her relief. Brigitte had not yet signed enough new guards to hold the city as large as Camelin, much less do anything else. But Elaine could not expect to see revenue from her estates before spring, and the mercenaries were expensive. Now she would not lose them for lack of gold before Brigitte recruited men to replace them. Next, Master Norrie? I fear the sewers must be given a high priority, my lady. The rats are breeding in them as if it were spring, and he mingled it all together, according to what he felt was most pressing. Norrie seemed to take it as a personal failure that he had not yet learned who had freed Elenia and Nayan, though less than a week had passed since their rescue. The price of grain was climbing exorbitantly, along with that of every other sort of foodstuff, and it was already apparent that repairs to the palace roof would take longer and cost more than the masons had first estimated. But food always grew more expensive as winter went on, and masons always cost more than they first had said they would. Norrie admitted that his last correspondence from New Brain was several days old, but the Borderlanders appeared content to remain where they were, which he could not understand. Any army, much less one as large as this was said to be, ought to be stripping the countryside around it bare by now. Elaine did not understand why either, but she was content that it was so, for the time being. Rumors in Cairhien of Aes Sedai swearing fealty to Rand at least gave a reason for Egwene's concern, though it hardly seemed likely any sister would actually do such a thing. That was the least important news in Norrie's estimation, but not in hers. Rand could not afford to alienate the sisters with Egwene. He could not afford to alienate any Aes Sedai, but he did seem to find ways to do so. Rena Harfor soon replaced Halwyn Nori, nodding to the bodyguards at the door in passing and giving Aviendha an open smile. If the plump, graying woman had ever been uncertain about Elaine calling Aviendha sister, she had never shown it, and now she genuinely appeared to approve. Smiles or no smiles, though, her report was much more grim than anything in the chief clerk's. "John Skelet is in the pay of House Aron, my lady," Rena said, her round face stern enough to fit a hangman.
I'll be right back.
"Twice now he has been seen accepting a purse from men known to favor Aron, and there is no doubt that Esther Norham is in someone's pay. She isn't stealing, but she has over 50 crowns of gold hidden under a loose floorboard, and she added 10 crowns last night." "Do as with the others," Elaine said sadly. The first maid had uncovered 9 spies she was certain of so far, 4 of them employed by people Rena had not yet been able to uncover. That Rena had found any at all were enough to anger Elaine, but the barber and the hairdresser were something more. Both had been in her mother's service. A pity they had not seen fit to transfer their loyalty to Morghez's daughter. Aviendha grimaced as Mistress Harfor murmured that she would, but there was no point in discharging the spies or killing them as Aviendha had suggested. They would just be replaced by spies she did not know. "A spy is your enemy's tool until you know her," her mother had said, "but then she is your tool. When you find a spy," Tom had told her, "wrap him in swaddling and feed him with a spoon." The men and women who had betrayed their service would be allowed to discover what Elaine wanted them to know, not all true, such as the numbers Brigitte had recruited. "And the other matter, Mistress Harfor?" "Nothing yet, my lady, but I have hopes," Rena said, even more grimly than before. "I have hopes." Following the first maid's departure came 2 delegations of merchants. First, a large group of Kandori with gem-studded earrings and silver guild chains draped across their chests, and then, right behind them, 6 Illianers with only a touch of embroidery on otherwise somber coats and dresses. She used one of the smaller reception rooms. The tapestries flanking the marble fireplace were of hunting scenes, not the white lion, and the polished wooden wall panels were uncarved. They were merchants, not diplomats, though some seemed to feel slighted that she offered only wine and did not drink with them. Kandori or Illianers, they also looked askance at the 2 guardswomen who followed her into the room and posted themselves beside the door, though if by this time they had not heard the tales of an attempt to kill her, they must be deaf. 6 more of her bodyguard waited outside the door. The Kandori studied Aviendha surreptitiously when not listening attentively to Elaine, and the Illianers avoided looking at her at all after the first widening of eyes in surprise. Doubtless they read significance into the presence of an Aiel, even if she only sat on the floor in a corner and said nothing. But whether Kandori or Illianers, the merchants wanted the same thing: reassurance that Elaine would not so anger the Dragon Reborn that he would interfere with trade by sending his armies and his Aiel to ravage Andor, though they did not come out and say so. Nor did they mention that Aiel and the Legion of the Dragon both had large encampments not many miles from Caemlyn. Their polite questions about her plans, now that she had removed the dragon banners and the banners of light from Caemlyn, were sufficient. She told them what she told everyone, that Andor would ally itself to the Dragon Reborn, but was not his conquest. In return, they offered vague wishes for her well-being, suggesting that they supported her claim to the Lion Throne wholeheartedly without actually saying any such thing. After all, if she failed, they would want to be welcome in Andor under whoever did gain the crown. When the Illianers had made their bows and curtsies and departed, she closed her eyes for a moment and rubbed her temples. She still had a meeting with a delegation of glassmakers before the midday meal, and 5 more with merchants or craftsfolk later. A very busy day, full of mealy-mouthed platitudes and ambiguity. And with Nynaeve and Marililla gone, it was her turn to teach the Windfinders again tonight. At best, a less pleasant experience than the worst meeting with merchants, which might leave her a little time to study the ter'angreal they had brought out of Ebou Dar before she was so weary that she could no longer keep her eyes open. It was embarrassing when Avienda had to half carry her to bed, but she could not stop. There was too much to be done and not enough time in a day. There was almost an hour before the glass made, but Avienda ruthlessly ran over her suggestion that she might take a peek at the things from every garden. Has Birgitta been talking to you? Elaine demanded, as she dragged her up a narrow flight of stone stairs. 4 guardswomen went ahead, and the others trailed behind, studiously ignoring what passed between her and Avienda. Though she thought that Rasuria Domanchi, a stocky hunter for the horn with the blue eyes and yellow hair occasionally found among Tyrans, wore a tiny smile. Do I need her to tell me you spend too many hours inside and sleep too little? Avienda replied contemptuously. You need fresh air. The air in the high colonnade was certainly fresh, and crisp, though the sun stood high in a grey sky. A cold breeze blew around the smooth columns, so the guardswomen standing ready to protect her from pigeons had to hang on to their plumed hats. Perversely, Elaine refused to ignore the chill. Dialin talked to you, she grumbled, shivering. Dialin claimed a woman with child needed long walks every day. She'd been quick to remind Elaine that, daughter heir or not, she was really only the high seat of House Trakand for the moment, and if the high seat of Trakand wanted to talk with the high seat of Tarabin, she could do it tramping up and down the palace corridors or not at all. Monaila has borne 7 children, Avienda replied. She says I must see you get fresh air. Despite no more than her shawl pulled over her shoulders, she gave no sign of feeling the wind. But then Aiel were as good as the sisters at ignoring the elements. Wrapping her arms around herself, Elaine scowled. Stop sulking, sister, Avienda said. She pointed down to one of the stable yards just visible over the white-tiled roofs. Look, Rihanna Corley is already checking to see if Marilula Siandevin is returning. The familiar vertical slash of light appeared in the stable yard and rotated into a hole in the air 10 feet tall and as wide. Elaine scowled down at Rihanna's head. She was not sulking. Perhaps she should not have taught Rihanna to travel, since the kinswoman was not yet Aes Sedai, but none of the other sisters were strong enough to make the weave work, and if the Windfinders were allowed to learn, then the few kinswomen who could should be allowed too in her book. Besides, she could not do everything herself. What? Had winter been this icy before she learned to stop heat and cold from touching her? To her surprise, Marililla rode through the gateway, shaking snow from her dark fur-lined cloak, followed by the helmeted guardsman who had been sent off with her 7 days earlier. Zaida and the Windfinders had been most unpleasant over her disappearance, to put it mildly, but the Grey had leaped at a chance to escape them for however long. It had been necessary to check for her every day, opening a gateway to the same spot, yet Elaine had not expected her for a week yet at the very best. As the last of the 10 red-cloaked guards entered the stable yard, the slim little Grey sister climbed down from her saddle, handed her reins to a groom, and hurried into the palace before the woman from the stables could more than get out of her way. I am enjoying the fresh air, Elaine said, just keeping her teeth from chattering. But if Marililla is back, I must go down. Avienda quirked an eyebrow as if she suspected the evasion, but she was the first to start for the stairs. Marililla's return was important, and by her haste she brought either very good news or very bad. By the time Elaine and her sister walked into her sitting room, followed by 2 of the guardswomen, of course, who planted themselves beside the doors, Marililla was already there. Her damp-spotted cloak lay over the back of a chair, her pale grey riding gloves were tucked behind her belt, and her black hair could have used a brush. With purple crescents under her dark eyes, Marililla's pale face looked as weary as Elaine felt. As quickly as she had come up from the stable yard, she was not alone. Birgitta, frowning pensively, stood with one hand on the carved mantel over the fireplace. The other gripped her long golden braid, almost like Nynaeve. Today she wore voluminous dark green trousers with her short red coat, a combination to make the eye flinch. And Captain Mellar made Elaine an elaborate bow, waving his white-plumed hat about. He had no place here, but she let him stay, and even gave him a very warm smile. Very warm. The plump young maid who had just placed a large silver tray on one of the sideboards blinked and looked wide-eyed at Mellar, before remembering to make her curtsy on going. Elaine held her smile until the door closed. Whatever protected her baby, she was willing to do. There was hot spiced wine on the rope work tray for everyone else, and weak tea for her. Well, at least it was hot. I was quite lucky, Marilla sighed once she was seated, giving Millar an uncertain glance over her wine cup. She knew the tale of him saving Elaine's life, but she had left before the rumors began. It turned out that Rihanna had opened her gateway not 5 miles from the Borderlanders. They have not moved since arriving. Her nose wrinkled. If not for the weather, the stench of latrines and horse dung would be overpowering. You were right, Elaine. All 4 live over there, in 4 camps a few miles apart. Each holds an army. I found the Shinarans the first day, and most of my time since has been spent talking with Isar of Shinar and the other 3. We met in a different camp each day. You spent a little time looking, too, I hope, Birgitta said respectfully from in front of the fireplace. She was respectful with every Aes Sedai except the one she was bonded to. How many are they? I don't suppose you got an accurate count, Millar put in, sounding as though he expected anything but. For once, his narrow face was unsmiling. Peering into his wine, he shrugged. Whatever you saw might have some value, though. If there are enough of them, they may starve themselves before they can threaten Caemlyn. The largest army in the world is just so many walking corpses without food and fodder. He laughed. Birgitta stared at his back darkly, but Elaine lifted a hand slightly at her side, motioning the other woman to keep silent. They are not in a good way for food, Captain, Marilla said coolly, sitting up straighter in spite of her obvious fatigue. But neither are they starving quite yet. I should not count on starvation to defeat them if it comes to that. After a little time away from the sea folk, her big eyes were no longer perpetually startled, and despite her smooth Aes Sedai composure, it was plain she had decided to dislike Dorlin Millar, no matter whose life he had saved. As for numbers, something over 200,000, I should say, and I very much doubt anyone but their own officers could be more accurate than that. Even hungry, that is a great many swords. Millar shrugged again, undisturbed by Aes Sedai's stares. The slim gray sister neither looked at him again nor ignored him in any obvious way. He just seemed to become a piece of the furniture for her as she went on. There are at least 10 sisters with them, Elaine, though they made a great effort to hide the fact. Not adherents to Egwene, I should think, though they need not be Elidas either. A good many sisters appear to be sitting to one side until the tower's troubles are over, I fear. She sighed again, perhaps not from tiredness this time. With a grimace, Elaine set her teacup aside. The kitchens had not sent up any honey, and she really did not like it bitter. What do they want, Marilla? The rulers, not the sisters. 10 sisters made that army 10 times as dangerous, especially to Rand. No to anyone. They haven't been sitting there in the snow all this time for the joy of it. The gray spread her slim hands slightly. Over the long run, I can only make suppositions. Over the short, they want to meet you, and as soon as possible. They sent riders toward Caemlyn when they arrived at New Brame, but this time of year it might take another week or more before they arrive here. Tenobia of Saldea let slip, or pretended to let slip. They know you have some connection to, or at least a close acquaintance with, a certain person in whom they also apparently have an interest. Somehow they know of your presence in Falma when certain events took place. Millar frowned in confusion, but no one enlightened him. I did not disclose traveling because of those sisters, but I did say I could return with a reply very soon. Elaine exchanged a look with Birgitta, who also shrugged, though in her case neither from detachment nor from disdain. The largest hole in Elaine's hopes to use the Borderlanders to influence her opponents for the throne had been how to approach sitting rulers while she was merely the high seat of Trakand and daughter-heir of a deceased queen. Birgitta's shrug said be thankful for the whole closing, but Elaine wondered how these people from the Borderlands had learned what very few others knew. And if they knew, how many more did, too? She would protect her unborn child. Would you be willing to go back right away, Marilla? She asked. The other sister accepted with alacrity, and with a slight widening of her eyes that suggested she would put up with any amount of stench to avoid returning to the Windfinders a little longer. Then we will go together. If they want to meet me soon, nothing can be sooner than today. They knew too much for delay. Nothing could be allowed to threaten her child. Nothing. Chapter 27. To surprise queens and kings. It was not quite so simple as just saying she would go, of course. This is unwise, sister, Aviendha said darkly, as Merililla scurried off to freshen herself. Scurried, in truth. The Grey seemed to be keeping a sharp eye out for sea folk before she reached the sitting room doors. When a sister of Elaine's standing said go, Merililla went. Arms folded and shawl wrapped around her, so she looked very much the wise one, Aviendha stood over Elaine at her writing table. This is very unwise. Wise? Brigida growled, feet apart and fists planted on her hips. Wise? The girl wouldn't know wise if it bit her on the nose. Why this rush? Let Merililla do what Greys do, arrange a party in a few days or a week. Queens hate being surprised, and kings despise it. Believe me, I know it to my cost. They find ways to make you regret it. The warder bond mirrored her anger and frustration. I want to catch them by surprise, Brigida. It might help me to find out just how much they know about me. Grimacing, Elaine pushed away the blotted page and took another sheet from the inlaid rosewood paper box. Her weariness had vanished with Merililla's news, but writing a steady, clean hand did seem difficult. The wording needed to be just right, too. This was not to be a letter from the daughter heir of Andor, but from Elaine Trakand, Aes Sedai of the Green Aja. They had to see what she wanted them to see. Try to talk some bloody sense into her, Aviendha, Brigida muttered. In case you can't, I had best see if I can scrape together a suitable flaming escort. No escort, Brigida, except for you. And Aes Sedai and her warder. And Aviendha, of course. Elaine paused in writing to smile at her sister, who did not smile back. I know your courage, Elaine, Aviendha said. I admire your courage. But even Shamad Konda knew when to be cautious. She spoke of caution. Aviendha would not know caution if it bit her on the nose. And Aes Sedai and her warder? Brigida explained. I told you, you can't go running off trying to have adventures anymore. No escort, Elaine said firmly, dipping her pen for another try. This isn't an adventure. It is just the way it must be done. Throwing up her hands, Brigida growled several oaths, but nothing Elaine had not heard before. To her surprise, Melar made no objection to staying behind. A meeting with 4 rulers would hardly be as boring as meeting merchants, but he begged leave to be about his duties since she did not need him. That contented her.
Hey, John McDonald, how you doing?
Would make the Borderlanders think of her as daughter heir sooner
Hope
than
you're
she
doing well.
Not to mention that Melar might decide to leer at her. Captain Melar's unconcern was not shared by the rest of her bodyguard, though. One of the guardswomen apparently went running for Kassela, because the tall Arafellan woman came striding into the sitting room while Elaine was still writing, demanding to accompany Elaine with the entire bodyguard. Brigida finally had to order her out to stop the protests. For once, Brigida appeared to recognize the fact that Elaine was not going to be budged.
Hell yeah.
Kassela to change her clothes. Well, she stomped off grumbling oaths, slamming the door behind her.
I'll do that with you here just a second.
You might have thought she would be happy for a chance to take off that Captain General's coat, but the bond might as well have been an echo of her curses. Aviendha did not curse.
Well, I'm not doing too bad. Can't complain too much.
Everything had to be done in such a whirlwind, though, that Elaine had an excuse to ignore them. Esunda was summoned and began laying out suitable garments.
How about yourself,
Elaine
John
hastily ate
McDonald?
her midday meal early. She had not sent for it. Aviendha had. Apparently, Monaella said missing meals was as bad as eating too much. Mistress Harfor, informed that she would have to handle the glassmakers and the other delegations as well, grimaced faintly, even as she inclined her head in acceptance. Before leaving, she announced that she had acquired goats for the palace. Elaine needed to drink goat's milk, and lots of it. Cariana groaned at hearing that she was to teach the Windfinders that night, but at least the woman made no comment on her diet. In truth, she hoped to be back in the palace by nightfall, but she also expected to be as tired as if she had already taught that lesson. Vandine did not offer advice either. Not of that sort. Elaine had studied the nations of the Blight border along with every other land as part of her education, and had discussed her intentions with the white-haired Green, who knew the borderlands well, yet she would have dearly loved to take Vandine along. Someone who had actually lived in the borderlands might see nuances that escaped her, but she did not dare do more than ask a few last hurried questions while Asanda was dressing her, just to reassure herself on the things Vandine had already told her. Not that she needed reassurance, she realized. She felt as focused as Brigitte drawing a bow. Finally, Rihanna had to be brought from where she was yet again trying to convince a former Suldam that she, too, could channel. Rihanna had been making that weave in the stable yard every day since she first wove it to send Marililla off. She could open it on the same spot in Brame Wood with no difficulty. There were no maps of that area in the palace that were good enough for Marililla to mark the camp's positions very well. And if Elaine or Avienda wove the gateway, it might open 10 miles or more farther from the camps than the small clearing Rihanna knew. The snow had stopped falling in Brame Wood before the gray returned, yet even so, 10 miles in fresh snow could mean another 2 hours at best. Elaine wanted this done quickly. Speed. Everyone had to move with speed. The sea folk must have been aware of the bustle that enveloped the palace, guardswomen running through the hallways carrying messages and fetching this person or that, but Elaine made sure they were told nothing. Suppose Zaida decided to come along, she was capable of having one of the windfinders make her own gateway if Elaine refused her, and the wave mistress was a complication to be avoided. The woman already behaved as though she was as much running the palace as Elaine herself. Zaida tried
this little cheap one, and then I'll show you guys the other one I got.
Making haste seemed beyond Asanda's ability, yet everyone else hiccups. And by the time the sun stood straight overhead, Elaine found herself riding Fireheart slowly through the snows of Brame Wood, near enough 50 leagues north of Camelin as the wild goose flew, but only a step through the gateway into thick forest of tall pine and leatherleaf and oak, mixed with gray-branched trees that had lost their leaves. Occasionally a broad meadow opened up, covered with snow like white carpets, unblemished save for the footprints of Marililla's running horse. Marililla had been sent ahead with the letter, and Elaine, Avienda, and Brigitte had followed after an hour to give her time to reach the borderlanders ahead of them. The road from Camelin to New Brame lay some miles to the west. Here they could have been 1,000 leagues from human habitation. For Elaine, dressing had been as serious as choosing armor. Her cloak was lined with marten for added warmth, but the material was dark green wool, soft yet thick, and her riding dress was green silk. Even her snug riding gloves were plain dark green. Unless the sword had been brown, that was the armor in which an eyes faced rulers. Her only visible jewelry was a small amber brooch in the shape of a turtle, and if anyone thought that odd, let them. An army of borderlanders was beyond any trap one of her rivals could lay, or even Elida. But those 10 sisters, 10 or more, might be Elida's. She was not about to let herself be bundled off back to the White Tower. We can turn back from this without incurring toll, Elaine. Avienda, scowling, still wore her Aiel garments, with her single silver necklace and heavy ivory bracelet. Her stocky bay was a hand shorter than Fireheart, or Brigitte's lean gray arrow, and much gentler to handle, though she handled it more easily than once she had. Dark-stockinged legs bared above the knee by straddling the saddle, she actually looked warm, except for the shawl wrapped around her head. Unlike Brigitte, she had not ceased her attempts to dissuade Elaine. Surprise is all very well, but they will respect you more if they must meet you halfway. I can hardly abandon Marililla, Elaine said more patiently than she felt. Perhaps she was not real any longer, but neither did she feel emotionally fresh, not at all ready to put up with badgering, but she did not want to snap at Avienda. She might feel something of a fool standing there with a letter announcing that I'm coming.
This one now.
Worse, I would feel a fool. Better to feel a fool than be one, Brigitte muttered, half under her breath. Her dark cloak spread behind her saddle, and her intricate braid hung from the opening of her hood almost to her waist. Pulling that hood up just enough to frame her face was the one concession she had made to the cold and the gusting wind. sometimes lifting fresh fallen snow like feathers. She did not want her vision obscured. The cover on her bow's saddle case, meant to keep the bowstring dry, hung down so she could reach the bow quickly. The suggestion that she wear a sword had been quashed with as much indignation as if Elaine had asked Avienda to wear one. Brigida knew the bow, but she claimed she might stab herself trying to draw a sword. Still, her short green coat would have blended into woodlands at another time of the year, and for a wonder, her wide-legged bonnets were the same color. She was a warder now, not the Captain General of the Queen's Guard, yet she was not so pleased by the title as might have been expected. The bond carried as much frustration as alertness. Elaine sighed, her breath misting. You two know what I hope to achieve here. You've known since I decided. Why are you suddenly treating me as if I'm made of blown glass? The pair exchanged looks past her, each waiting for the other to speak first, then silently turned to stare straight ahead, and suddenly she knew. When my child is born, she said, you can both apply to be her wife. If her child was alive. If Min had said it was lost in Avienda and Brigida's wine-hazed memories of that night.
That was a good.
It might be better to have a son first,
that was a good one.
So he could begin his training before his sister came. Yet a daughter secured the succession, while a lone son would be pushed aside. And as much as she wanted more than one, nothing said she would have another child. I might send her more of Rand's children, but she had to be practical. I myself do not need a wet nurse. Avienda's sun-darkened cheeks turned darker. Brigida's expression did not change, yet the same emotion oozed along the warder bond. They rode slowly, following Marililla's tracks for close on 2 hours, and Elaine was thinking that the nearest camp must be very close, when Brigida suddenly pointed ahead and said, Shinarans, then eased her bow in its case. Alertness swallowed frustration and everything else in the bond. Avienda touched the hilt of her belt knife as if making sure it was there. Waiting beneath the trees, off to one side from Marililla's traces, men and horses alike were so still that Elaine almost took them for natural outcrops of some sort, until she made out the strange swooping crests on their helmets. Their mounts were not armored, as Shinaran Heavy's animals often were, but the men themselves wore plate mail, with long-hilted swords on their backs, and swords and maces hung at their belts and from their saddles. Their dark eyes never blinked. One of the horses swished its tail, and the movement seemed startling. A sharp-faced man with a harsh voice spoke as Elaine and the other 2 women drew rein in front of him. The crest atop his helmet looked like narrow wings. King Isar sends his assurance of your safety, Elaine, said I, and I add my own. I am Kaen Yokata, Lord of Foul Eisen, and may peace abandon me and the blight consume my soul if harm befalls you or anyone with you in our camp. That was not so comforting as Elaine might have wished. All these guarantees of her safety only made it clear that there had been some question of it, and might still be. Doesn't Aes Sedai assurances from Shinarans, she said. She started to run through a novice exercise for calmness and realized she did not need it. Very strange. You may lead, Lord Kaen. He merely nodded and turned his horse. Some of the Shinarans glanced at Avienda without expression, recognizing an Aiel, but for the most part they simply fell in behind. Only the hooves crunching the harder snow beneath the fresh fall broke the silence of their short ride. She had been right. The Shinaran camp was very close. She began to see sentries, mounted and armored, just minutes later, and soon after that they rode into the Shinaran camp. Sprawled among the trees, the encampment seemed larger than she had imagined. Whether she looked left, right, or ahead, tents and cook fires, lines of tethered horses, and rows of wagons stretched out of her sight. As she and her escort passed, soldiers looked up in curiosity, hard-faced men with their heads shaved except for a tuft on top that was sometimes long enough to reach the shoulders. Few wore any part of their armor, but armor and weapons always lay close to hand. The smell was not so bad as Marililla had described, though she could make out the faint odor of latrines and horse dung beneath the aroma of whatever was boiling in all these cookpots. No one appeared hungry, though many were lean. Not the leanness of starvation, though, just that of men who had never carried much fat on them. She did notice that there were no spits over any fire she could see. Meat would be harder to come by than grain, though grain itself was in short enough supply this late in winter. Barley soup did not strengthen a man the way meat did. They needed to move soon. Nowhere could support 4 armies this size for long. She just had to make sure they moved in the right direction. Not everyone she saw was a soldier with a shaven head, of course, though the men among them looked almost as hard. There were soldiers making arrows, wheelwrights working on wagons, farriers shoeing horses, laundresses stirring boiling kettles, women working with needles who might have been seamstresses or wives. Great numbers of people always followed an army, sometimes as many as the soldiers themselves. She did not see anyone who could have been Aes Sedai, though. Sisters were unlikely to push up their sleeves and work wooden paddles into laundry kettles, or don patched woolens and sit darning breeches. Why did they want to remain hidden? She resisted the desire to embrace the source, to draw Saidar through the turtle angreal pinned to her breast. One battle at a time, and first she must fight for Andor. Before a much larger tent than any of the others she could see, low canvas with a single long peak, Kayan dismounted and handed her down. He hesitated over whether to do the same for Brigitte and Avienda, but Brigitte solved his dilemma by stepping down smoothly and handing her reins to a waiting soldier, Avienda by half falling out of the saddle. She had improved her riding, but mounting and dismounting still gave her difficulty. Glaring around her to see whether anyone was laughing, she smoothed down her bulky skirts, then unwrapped the shawl from around her head and settled it on her shoulders. Brigitte watched her horse being taken away as though she wished she had taken her bow and quiver from the saddle. Kayan pulled open one of the entry flaps and bowed. Drawing a last deep, calming breath, Elaine led the other 2 women in. She could not allow them to see her as a supplicant. She was not here to beg or to defend. Sometimes, Gareth Bryn had told her when she was a child, you find yourself outnumbered, with no path to slip away. Always do what your enemy least expects, Elaine. In that case, you must attack. From the start, she must attack. Inside, Marililla glided to her across the layered carpets laid down for a floor. The diminutive Grey's smile was not precisely relieved, but clearly she was glad to see Elaine. Aside from her, there were only 5 others present, 2 women and 3 men, and one of the latter was a servant, an old cavalryman by his bowed legs and scarred face, who came to take cloaks and gloves, and blink at Avienda, before retreating to a plain wooden table that held a silver tray with a tall-necked pitcher and an array of cups. The other 4 ruled the nations of the borderlands. A scattering of backless camp chairs and 4 large braziers holding glowing coals completed the tent's furnishings. This was not the sort of reception the daughter-heir of Andor might have expected, with courtiers and many servants and idle conversations to be made before serious discussions could begin, and men and women at those rulers' shoulders to advise them. What she found was what she had hoped for. Healing had rid Marililla's eyes of their dark circles before she left the palace, and she made Elaine's introduction with simple dignity. This is Elaine Trakand of the Green Aja, as I told you. That, and nothing more. Elaine knew enough from Van Dien to pick out one from another of the 4 rulers who faced her. I give you welcome, Elaine Sedai, Isar of Shinar said. Peace and the light favor you. He was a short man, no taller than herself, slim in a bronze-colored coat, his face unwrinkled despite a long white topknot that hung over the side of his head. Looking at his sad eyes, she reminded herself that he was accounted a wise ruler and a skilled diplomat as well as a fine soldier. In appearance, he was none of those things. May I offer you wine? The spices are not fresh, but they have gained extra sharpness with age. When Marililla told us you would come all the way from Camelin today, I confess I would have doubted her were she not Aes Sedai. Atheniella of Kandor, perhaps half a hand taller than Marililla, was plump, her black hair lightly dusted with gray, but there was nothing motherly about her despite her smile. Regal dignity clothed her as much as did her fine blue wool. Her eyes were blue, too, clear and level. We are pleased that you did come. Pytar of Arafel said in a surprisingly deep, rich voice that made Elaine feel warmed somehow. We have much to discuss with you. Vandine had said he was the most beautiful man in the Borderlands, and perhaps he had been long ago, but age had laid deep lines in his face, and only a fringe of short gray hair remained on his head. He was tall and broad-shouldered, though, in plain green, and he did look strong, and not a fool. Where the others carried their years with grace, Tenobia of Saldaea flaunted youth, if not beauty, with her eagle's beak of a nose and wide mouth. Her tilted, almost purple eyes, level with Elaine's, were her best feature, perhaps her only one. Where the others dressed differently, even if they did rule nations, her pale blue dress was worked with pearls and sapphires, and she wore more sapphires in her hair. Suitable for the court, but hardly for a camp. And where they were courteous, under the light, Marilola Sedai, Tenobia said in a high voice, frowning. I know you speak truth, but she looks more a child than an Aes Sedai. You did not mention she would be bringing a black-eyed Aiel. Isar's face never changed, but Pytar's mouth tightened, and Atheniella went so far as to cut her eyes briefly toward Tenobia in a glance that would have suited another. A very irritated and displeased mother. Black, Avienda muttered in confusion. My eyes are not black. I never saw black except on a peddler until I crossed the dragon wall. You know I can speak only the truth, Tenobia, and I assure you, Marilola began. Elaine silenced her with a touch on the arm. It is enough that you know I am Aes Sedai, Tenobia. This is my sister, Avienda, of the Nine Valleys Sept of the Tar of Aiel. Avienda smiled at them, or at least bared her teeth. This is my warder, Lady Birgitta Trahelian. Birgitta made a short bow, her golden braids swaying. One announcement caused as many startled looks as the other. An Aiel woman was her sister? Her warder was a woman? But Tenobia and the others ruled lands on the edge of the Blight, where nightmares truly might walk abroad in daylight, and anyone who let themselves be startled too greatly was as good as dead. Elaine gave them no chance to recover fully, though. Attack before they know what you are doing, Gareth Bryn had said, and keep attacking until you rout them or break through. Shall we consider the niceties completed, she said, taking a cup that gave off the aroma of spiced wine from the tray proffered by the old soldier. A surge of caution flowed along the warder bond, and she saw Avienda glance sideways at the cup, but she did not mean to drink. She was just glad neither actually spoke. Only a fool would think you have come all this way to invade Andor, she said, walking to the chairs and sitting. Rulers or not, they had no choice but to follow or stare at her back. At Birgitta's back, since she stood behind her. As usual, Avienda folded herself to the floor and arranged her skirts in a neat fan. They followed. The Dragon Reborn brings you, Elaine went on. You requested this audience with me because I was at Falme. The question is, why is that important to you? Do you think I can tell you more of what happened there than you already know? The Horn of Valier was sounded, dead heroes out of legend rode against Seanchan invaders, and the Dragon Reborn fought the Shadow in the sky for all to see. If you know that much, you know as much as I. Audience? Tenobia said incredulously, pausing half-seated. The camp chair creaked as she let herself drop the rest of the way. No one requested an audience, even if you already held the throne of Andor. But to stay to the point, Tenobia, Pytar broke in mildly. Rather than sitting, he stood, occasionally sipping at his wine. Elaine was glad she could see the wrinkles on his face. His voice could confuse a woman's thoughts otherwise. Atheniella spared Tenobia another quick glance while seating herself, and murmured something under her breath. Elaine thought she heard the word marriage with a rueful sound, but that made no sense. In any case, she turned her attention to Elaine as soon as she was settled in her chair. I might like your ferocity another time, Elaine Sedai, but there's little to enjoy falling into an ambush that one of your own allies has helped lay. Tenobia scowled, though Atheniella did not even dart those sharp eyes in her direction. What happened at Falme, the Queen of Kandor told Elaine, is not so important as what came of it. No, Pytar, we must tell her what we must tell her. She already knows too much for anything else. We know that you were a companion to the Dragon Reborn at Falmouth, Elaine. A friend, perhaps. You are right. We have not come to invade. We have come to find the Dragon Reborn. And we have marched all this way only to find that no one knows where he is to be found. Do you know where he is? Elaine hid her relief at the blunt question. It would never have been asked if she thought she was more than a companion or a friend. She could be just as blunt. Attack and keep attacking. Why do you want to find him? Emissaries or messengers could take any word you wanted to send him, which was as good as asking why they brought vast armies. Isar had taken no wine, and he stood with his fists on his hips. The war against the Shadow is fought along the Blight, he said grimly. The last battle will be fought in the Blight, if not at Shael Ghul itself. And he ignores the borderlands and concerns himself with lands that have not seen a Myrddraal since the Trolloc Wars. The Karakan decides where to dance the spears, Wetlander, Aviendha sneered. If you follow him, then you fight where he says. No one looked at her. They were all looking at Elaine. No one took the opening Aviendha had offered. Elaine made herself breathe evenly and meet their gazes without blinking. A borderland army was too great a trap for Elaida to lay in order to catch Elaine Trakand, but Randall 4, the Dragon Reborn, might be another matter. Marililla shifted on her chair, but she had her instructions. No matter how many treaties the Grey Sister had negotiated, once Elaine began, she was to keep silent. Confidence flowed along the bond with Brigitte. Rand was a stone, unreadable and distant. You know of the White Tower's proclamation regarding him? She asked quietly. They must, by now. The Tower calls anathema on anyone who approaches the Dragon Reborn save through the offices of the Tower, Pytar said just as quietly. Taking a seat at last, he regarded her with serious eyes. You are Aes Sedai. Surely that counts as the same thing. The Tower meddles everywhere, Tenobia muttered. No, Nathaniela, I will say this. The whole world knows the Tower is divided. Do you follow Elaida or the rebels, Elaine? The world seldom knows what it thinks it knows, Marililla said, in a voice that seemed to lower the temperature in the tent. The tiny woman who ran when Elaine ordered her and squeaked when windfinders looked at her sat up straight and faced Tenobia as an Aes Sedai, her smooth face as frosty as her tone. The affairs of the Tower are for others to know, Tenobia. If you want to learn, ask to have your name written in the novice book, and in 20 years you might learn a little. Her illumined majesty, Tenobia Sibashir Khazadi, Shield of the North and Sword of the Blight Border, High Seat of House Khazadi, Lady of Shahani, Aznella, Kunwar, and Ganai, glared at Marililla with all the fury of a blizzard, and said nothing. Elaine's respect for her increased slightly. Marililla's disobedience did not distress her. It saved her from trying to prevaricate while seeming to speak only the truth. Egwene said they must try to live as if they had already sworn the 3 oaths, and here and now Elaine felt the weight of it. Here she was not the daughter-heir of Andor struggling to claim her mother's throne, or not only that. She was an Aes Sedai of the Green Aja, with more reason for taking care with her words than simply hiding what she wanted to remain hidden. I cannot tell you exactly where he is. Truth, because she could only have given them a vague direction, roughly toward Tyr, and no telling how far. Truth, because she did not trust them sufficiently for even that. She just had to be careful what she said, and how. I do know that apparently he intends to remain where he is a while. He had not moved for days, the first time since leaving her that he had remained in any one place longer than half a day. I will tell you what I can, but only if you agree that you will march south within the week. You will run out of barley as well as meat if you remain here much longer anyway. I promise you, you will be marching toward the Dragon Reborn. To begin with, they would be at any rate. Pytar shook his bald head. You want us to enter Andor? Elaine Sedai, or should I call you Lady Elaine now? I wish you the Light's blessing in your quest for Andor's crown, but not enough to offer my men to fight for it. Elaine Sedai and Lady Elaine are one and the same, she told them. I do not ask you to fight for me. In truth, I hope with all my heart that you cross Andor without so much as a skirmish. Raising her silver wine cup, she wet her lips without drinking. A flash of caution surged through the warder bond, and in spite of herself, Elaine laughed. Avienda was watching her from the corner of her eye and frowning. Even now, they were going to look after the mother-to-be. I'm glad someone finds this amusing, Atheniella said wryly. Try to think like a Southlander, Pytar. We play the game of houses here, and I think she is being very clever at it. She should be, I suppose. I've always heard that Aes Sedai created Desdemar. Think tactics, Pytar. Isar was studying Elaine, wearing a small smile. We move toward Caemlyn as invaders, so any Andoran will see it. Winter may be mild here, but we'll still need weeks to ride that far. By the time we do, she will have rallied enough of the Andoran houses against us and to her that she will have the Lion Throne or near enough. At the least, enough strength will have been pledged to her that no one else will be able to stand long against her. Zenobia shifted on her chair, frowning and adjusting her skirts, but there was a respect in her eyes when she looked at Elaine that had not been there before. And when we reach Caemlyn, Elaine Sedai, Atheniella said, you will negotiate us into leaving Andor without a battle being fought. That came out as not quite a question, but almost. Very clever indeed. If all works as she plans, Isar said, his smile fading. He put out a hand without looking, and the old soldier placed a wine cup in it. Battles seldom do, even this bloodless sort, I think. I very much want it all to be bloodless, Elaine said. Light it had to be, or instead of saving her country from civil war, she had plunged it into worse. I will work hard to see that it is. I expect you to do the same. Do you also happen to know where my uncle Davram is, Elaine Sedai? Zenobia said suddenly. Davram Bashir? I would like to speak with him as much as with the Dragon Reborn. Lord Davram is not far from Caemlyn, Zenobia. I cannot promise he will still be there when you arrive, though. That is, if you agree? Elaine made herself breathe to hide her anxiety. She was beyond where she could turn back now. They would move south now, she was certain, but without their agreement, there would be bloodshed. For a long moment there was silence in the tent, except for a coal cracking in one of the braziers. Atheniella exchanged glances with the two men. So long as I get to see my uncle, Zenobia said heatedly, I am agreed. On my honor, I am agreed, Isar said decisively. And almost atop him, if in a milder tone, Pytar said, under the light, I am agreed. And so are we all, Atheniella breathed. And now your part, Elaine Sedai. Where do we find the Dragon Reborn? A thrill shot through Elaine, and she could not say whether it was exhilaration or fear. She had done what she had come for, risked the dangers for herself and for Andor, and only time would tell whether she had made the right decision. She answered without hesitation. As I told you, I cannot say exactly where. A search in Murundi will be profitable, though. Truth, though the profit would be hers, not theirs, if any came. Egwene had moved from Murundi today, taking away the army that had held Arathella Renshar and the other nobles in the south. Perhaps the Borderlanders moving south would force Arathella and Luon and Pelavar to decide, as Dylan believed they would, to support her. The light sent it so. Except for Zenobia, the Borderlanders did not seem at all exultant over learning where to find Rand. Atheniella let out a long breath, almost a sigh, and Isar simply nodded and pursed his lips in thought. Pytar drank down half his wine, the first real drink he had taken. It very much seemed that however much they wanted to find the Dragon Reborn, they were not looking forward to meeting him. Zenobia, on the other hand, called for the old soldier to bring her wine, and went on about how much she wanted to see her uncle. Elaine would not have thought the woman had so much family feeling. Night came early that time of year, and only a few hours of daylight remained, as Isar pointed out, offering beds for the night. Atheniella suggested that her own tent would be more comfortable, yet they gave no sign of disappointment when Elaine said she must leave immediately. Remarkable that you can cover such distance so quickly, Atheniella murmured. I have heard Aes Sedai speak of a thing called traveling. A lost talent? Have you encountered many sisters on your journey? Elaine asked. Some, Atheniella replied. There are Aes Sedai everywhere, it seems. Even Tenobia was suddenly expressionless. Allowing Brigitte to lay the marten-lined cloak on her shoulders, Elaine nodded. So there are. Would you have our horses brought? None of them spoke again until they were out of the camp, riding through the trees. The horse smell and latrine stink had seemed mild in the camp, but their absence here made the air seem very fresh, and the snow whiter somehow. You were very quiet, Brigitte Trehilian, Avienda said, thumping her bay's ribs with her heels. She always believed the animal would stop without reminders to keep going. A warder doesn't speak for her Aes Sedai. She bloody listens and watches her back, Brigitte replied dryly. It was unlikely the forest contained anyone who might threaten them, this near the Shienaran camp, but her bow remained uncovered, and her eyes scanned the trees. A much hastier form of negotiation than I am used to, Elaine, Marililla said. Normally these matters require days or weeks of talking, if not months, before anything is agreed. You were lucky they are not Damani. Or Karienan, she admitted judiciously. Borderlanders are refreshingly open and straightforward. Elaine shook her head slightly. They wanted to find Rand, but concealed Rand. They concealed the presence of sisters. At least they would be moving away from him once she had them on their way to Murundi. That would have to do for now, but she had to warn him once she could figure out how to help him without endangering him. Take care of him, men. Take care of him for us. A few miles from the camp, she reined in to study the forest as assiduously as Brigitte, especially behind them. The sun sat low on the treetops. The trotting white fox appeared for an instant and was gone. Something flickered on a bare gray branch. A bird, perhaps, or a squirrel. A dark hawk suddenly plummeted out of the sky, and a thin squeal broke the air and ended suddenly. They were not being followed. It was not the Shienarans she worried about, but those hidden sisters. The weariness that had vanished earlier with the last news had returned with interest now that her meeting with the Borderlanders was done. She wanted nothing so much as to climb into her bed as soon as possible, but she just wanted enough to give the weave for traveling to sisters she did not know. She could have woven a gateway to the palace stable yard, but only at the risk of killing someone who happened to be crossing where it opened. So instead, she wove one for another place she knew just as well. She was so tired that it required effort to weave, so tired that she did not think of the angreal pinned to her dress until the silvery slash had appeared in the air and opened onto a field covered with brown grass beaten flat by earlier snowfall. A field just south of Camelin where Gareth Bryn had often taken her to watch the Queen's Guards ride to command, breaking from columns to form a line 4 abreast at a shouted order. Are you just going to look at it? Brigitte demanded. Elaine blinked. Avienda and Marililla were studying her with concern. Brigitte's face gave nothing away, but the bond carried worry too. I was just thinking, Elaine said, and heeled Fireheart through the gateway. Bed would be wonderful. From the old practice field to the tall arched gates set in the pale 50-foot-high city walls was a short ride. The long market buildings lining the approach to the gates were empty at this hour, but sharp-eyed guardsmen still kept a watch. They watched her and the others ride in, apparently without recognizing her. Mercenaries, very likely. They would not know her unless they saw her on the Lion Throne. With the help of the light and luck, they would see her there. Twilight was fast approaching, the sky turning a deep gray and the shadows slanting long across the streets. Very few people were still out and about, a scattering of folk hurrying to finish their day's work before going home to dinner and a warm fire. A pair of bearers carrying a merchant's dark lacquered sedan chair went trotting past along a street ahead, and a few moments later one of the big pump wagons rumbled in the other direction behind 8 running horses, its iron-shod wheels loud on the paving stones. Another fire somewhere. They happened most often at night. A A patrol of 4 guardsmen walked their horses toward her and on, without looking at her twice. They did not recognize her any more than the men at the gates. Swaying in her saddle, she rode, wishing for her bed. It was a shock to realize that she was being lifted down from her saddle. She opened eyes she did not remember closing and found herself being carried into the palace in Brigitta's arms. "Put me down," she said tiredly. "I can still walk." "You can hardly stand up," Brigitta growled. "Be still." "You cannot talk with her," Aviendha said loudly. "She really does need sleep, Master Nari," Marililla said in firm tones. "Tomorrow will have to do." "Forgive me, but tomorrow will not do," Nari replied, for a wonder sounding very firm himself. "It is urgent I speak with her now." Elaine's head wanted to wobble as she lifted it. Halwyn Nari was clutching that leather folder to his skinny chest, as always, but the dry man who talked of crowned heads with the same dusty tone he used for speaking of the roof repairs was almost dancing on his toes in an effort to get by Aviendha and Marililla, who each had him by an arm, holding him back. "Put me down, Brigitta," she said again, and for the second wonder in as many moments, Brigitta obeyed. She kept a supporting arm around Elaine, though, for which Elaine was grateful. She was not sure her legs would have supported her for very long. "What is it, Master Nori?" "Let the man go, Aviendha." "Marililla?" The first clerk darted forward as soon as they let go of him. "Word began arriving soon after you left, my lady," he said, not sounding dusty at all. Worry pinched his brows. "There are 4 armies. Small, I should say now, I suppose. Light. I recall when 5,000 men was an army." He rubbed a hand over his bald head, leaving the white tufts rising behind his ears in ruffled disarray. "There are 4 small armies approaching Caelin from the east," he went on in a more usual tone for him. "Almost. They will be here inside the week, I fear. 20,000 men, perhaps 30. I cannot be sure." He half extended the folder to her as if offering to show her the papers inside. He was agitated. "Who?" she said. Elenia had estates and forces in the east, but so did Nayan. But neither could raise 20,000 men, and the snow and mud should have held them until spring. "Should and would build no bridges," she seemed to hear Lini's calm voice say. "I do not know, my lady," Nari replied. "Not yet." It did not matter, Elaine supposed. Whoever it was, they were coming, and now. "At first light, Master Nori, I want you to begin buying all the foodstuffs you can find outside the walls and get it brought in. Brigitta, have the bannerman announcing the signing bounty add that mercenaries have 4 days to sign with the guards or they must leave the city. And have announcements made to the people too, Master Nori. Whoever wants to leave before the siege begins should go now. It will cut down the number of mouths we have to feed, and it might lead a few more men to enlist in the guards." Pushing away from Brigitta's support, she strode along the hallway, heading for her apartments. The others were forced to follow. "Marililla, let the kinswomen know, and the Athan Nier. They may want to leave before it begins, too. Maps, Brigitta. Have the good maps brought to my apartments. And another thing, Master Nori." There was no time for sleep, no time for weariness. She had a city to defend.
Chapter 28. News in a Cloth Sack. The morning after Matt promised to help Teslin, if he could, and Jolene, and this Edicina he had yet to lay eyes on, Tylin announced that she was departing the city. "Suroth is going to show me how much of Altara I control now, Pigeon," she said. Her belt knife was stuck in the carved bedpost, and they were still lying on the rumpled linen sheets amid a tangle of bedding, him in only the silk scarf that hid the hanging scar around his neck, and her in her skin. A very fine skin it was, too, as smooth as he had ever touched. Idly she traced his other scars with a long, green-lacquered fingernail. One way and another he had acquired quite a few, though not for want of trying to avoid them. His hide would not bring much at auction, that was for sure, but the scars fascinated her. It wasn't her idea, actually. Tuon thinks it will help me if I see with my own eyes instead of just on a map. And what that girl suggests, Suroth does. She would like to see it done yesterday, though. We'll be going by Toraken, so to cover the ground quickly. As much as 200 miles in a day, it seems. Oh, don't look sick, Piglet. I won't make you climb on one of those things. Matt heaved a sigh of relief. It had not been the prospect of flying that upset him. He thought he might actually like that. But if he was out of Ebou Dar for any length of time, the light alone knew whether Teslin or Jolie, or even this Edicina, might grow impatient enough to do something stupid, or what idiocy Beslin might get up to. Beslin worried him almost as much as the women. Tylan, excited by her coming flight on one of those Shan beasts, looked more an eagle than ever. I'll be gone little more than a week, sweetling. That green fingernail traced the foot-long puckering that slanted across his ribs. Shall I tie you to the bed so I'll know you will be safe till I return? Returning her wicked smile with his most winning grin took a bit of effort. He was fairly sure she was joking, but only fairly. The clothes she chose today put him all in red, brilliant enough to hurt the eye. All red except for the flowers worked on the coat and the cloak anyway, and his black hat and scarf. The white lace at his neck and wrists only made the rest look redder. Still, he scrambled into them, eager to get out of her apartments. With Tylan, a man was wise not to be too sure of anything. She might not be joking, too. Tylan had not exaggerated Suroth's impatience, it appeared. In little more than 2 hours by the jeweled cylinder clock in Tylan's sitting room, a gift from Suroth, he was accompanying the Queen to the docks. Well, Suroth and Tylan rode at the head of the 20 or so other blood that were to accompany them, and their assorted Sojin, men and women who bowed their half-shaved heads to the blood and stared down their noses at everyone else, while he rode behind on Pips. An Altaran queen's pretty could not ride with the blood, which included Tylan herself now, of course. It was not as if he was a hereditary servant or anything of that level. The blood and most of the Sojin were mounted on fine animals, sleek mares with arched necks and a delicate step, deep-chested geldings with fierce eyes and strong withers. His luck seemed to have no effect on horse racing, but he would have wagered on Pips against any of them. The blunt-nosed bay gelding was not showy, but Matt was sure he could outrun nearly all of those pretty animals in a sprint, and all of them over a long haul. After so long in the stables, Pips wanted to frisk if he could not run, and it took all Matt's skill, well, all the skill that had somehow come with those other men's memories, to keep the animal in hand. Before they were halfway to the docks, though, his leg was aching to the hip. If he was to leave Ebou Dar any time soon, it would have to be by sea, or with Luca's show. He had a good notion how to make the man leave before spring, if it came to that. A dangerous notion, maybe, but he did not see much choice. The alternative was riskier still. He was not alone at the rear. More than 50 men and women, blessedly wearing thick white woolen robes over the sheer garments they usually went around in, marched behind him in 2 rows, some leading pack horses with large wicker hampers full of delicacies. The blood could not do without their servants. In fact, they seemed to think they would be sleeping rough with so few. The Dakavale seldom raised their eyes from the paving stones, and their faces were meek as milk. He had seen a Dakavale sent for a strapping once, a yellow-haired man about his age, and the fellow had raced to bring the instrument of his own punishment. He had not even tried to delay or hide, much less escape the strapping. I could not understand people like that. Ahead of him rode 6 Suldam, their short divided skirts showing their ankles. Very nice ankles on 1 or 2, but the women sat their saddles as if they were of the blood too. The cowls of their lightning-paneled cloaks hung down their backs, and they let the cold gusts lift the cloaks as though the chill did not touch them, or would not dare. 2 had leashed Damani walking beside their horses. Matt studied the women surreptitiously. One of the Damani, a short woman with pale blue eyes, was linked by a silvery eidam to the plump olive-skinned Suldam he had seen walking Teslin. The dark-haired Damani answered to the name Pura. The Aes Sedai agelessness was clear on her smooth face. He had not really believed Teslin when she said the woman had become a true Damani, but the graying Suldam leaned low in her saddle to say something to the woman who had been Rima Galfrey, and whatever it was the Suldam murmured, Ura laughed and clapped her hands in delight. Matt shivered. She would bloody well shout for help if he tried to take the Idam from her neck. Wait, what was he thinking of? Bad enough that he was stuck with pulling 3 Aes Sedai's bacon off the fire for them. Burn him, but he did seem to get lumbered with doing that every time he bloody turned around. Bad enough that, without thinking about trying to get any more out of Abu Dar. Abu Dar was a great seaport, with perhaps the largest harbor in the known world, and the docks were long gray fingers of stone thrusting out from the quay that ran the whole length of the city. Almost all the mooring spots were taken by Seanchan vessels of every size, the crews in the rigging and cheering vigorously as Suroth passed by, a thunder of voices calling her name. The men on other ships waved their arms and shouted as well, though many appeared confused as to who or what they were cheering. No doubt they thought it expected of them. On those vessels, the wind blowing across the harbor stirred the golden bees of Ilion, and the crescent moons of Tyr, and the golden hawk of Mayenne. Apparently, Rand had not ordered the merchants there to stop trading with Seanchan-held ports, or else the merchants were going behind his back. Colors flashed through Matt's skull, and he shook his head to clear it. Most merchants would trade their mother's murderer if it brought profit. The southernmost dock had been cleared of ships. Seanchan officers with thin plumes on their lacquered helmets stood waiting to hand Suroth and Talon down into one of the large rowboats that stood waiting, 8 men on the long oars of each. After Talon gave Matt a last kiss anyway, almost yanking his hair out to pull his head down, and after she pinched his bottom as though no one was bloody watching. Suroth frowned impatiently until Talon was settled in the longboat, and in truth the Seanchan woman did not stop chafing even then, twitching her fingers at Alwyn, or Sojin, as the sharp-faced woman was continually scrambling across the benches to fetch her one thing or another. The rest of the blood received deep bows from the officers, but had to climb down the ladders with their Sojin's aid.
Be right back.
The Suldam helped the Damani into the boats, and no one at all helped the white-robed folk load the pack antlers and themselves. Soon enough, the boats were crossing the harbor toward where the Rakan and Torakan were kept south of the Rahad, spidering through the sprawling anchored fleet of Seanchan ships, and the scores of captured seafolk vessels that dotted the harbor. The greater number of those appeared to have been re-rigged with ribbed Seanchan sails and different lines. Their crews were Seanchan too. Excepting the windfinders he tried not to think about, and maybe some who had been sold, the surviving Atha'an Mier, were all in the Rahad with the other Dako Vale clearing the silted-up canals. And there was nothing he could do about it. He did not owe them anything. He had more on his plate than he could handle already. And there was nothing he could do. That was all there was to it. He wanted to ride away immediately, to leave the seafolk ships behind him. No one on the docks paid him the slightest heed. The officers had gone away as soon as the boats cast off. Someone, he did not know who, had taken the pack horses away. The seamen climbed out of the rigging and went back to their work, and the members of the Cargo Loaders Guild began pushing their low, heavy barrows stacked with bales and crates and barrels. But if he left too soon, Talon might decide he was planning to keep riding right out of the city and send for him. So he sat Pips on the end of the dock and waved like a bull-goose fool, though she was far enough away that she could not see him without a looking-glass. Despite the throbbing leg, he rode slowly back up almost the whole length of the quay. He avoided looking at the harbor again. Soberly dressed merchants stood watching their cargo being loaded or unloaded, sometimes slipping a purse to a man or woman in a green leather vest to obtain gentler handling for their goods or more speed, and that it seemed possible the guildfolk could move any faster. Southerners always seemed to move at a half-trot unless the sun was right overhead, when the heat here could roast a duck. And with a gray sky and a cutting wind off the sea, it would have been cold no matter where the sun stood. By the time he was abreast of the Mulhara, he had counted more than 20 Suldam patrolling the docks with Damani, poking their noses into boats, leaving anchored ships that were not Seanchan, boarding any vessel newly arrived at the docks, or, for that matter, ready to cast off lines. He had been quite sure they would be there. was going to have to be Balam Luka. The only alternative was just too hazardous, except in an emergency. Luka was chancy too, but the only real choice left. Back at the Tarasin Palace, he climbed down off Pips with a wince and pulled his walking staff out from behind the saddle girth. Letting a groom take the bay, he limped inside, his left leg barely able to support his weight. Maybe a soak in a hot bath would take some of the pain. Maybe then he could think. Luka had to be caught by surprise, but before it came to Luka, there were a few other little problems to overcome.
Ah, there you are,
Noel said, popping up in front of him. Matt had caught only glimpses of the old man since getting him a bed, but he looked well rested in his freshly brushed gray coat, considering that he vanished into the city every day and only returned to the palace at night. Adjusting the bits of lace at his cuffs, he smiled confidingly, revealing the gaps in his teeth.
You are planning something, Lord Matt, and I would like to offer my services.
I'm planning to take the weight off my leg, Matt said as casually as he could. Noel seemed harmless enough. According to Harnan, he told stories before going to sleep, stories that Harnan and the other Red Arms seemed to swallow whole, even the one about some place called Shibuya, supposedly beyond the Aiel Waste, where women who could channel had tattooed faces, over 300 crimes carried a penalty of death, and giants lived under the mountains, men taller than Ogier, with their faces on their bellies. He claimed to have been there. No one who made claims like that could be anything but harmless. On the other hand, the one time Matt had seen him handle those long daggers he carried under his coat, he had looked far from harmless. There was a way a man had of touching a weapon that said he was accustomed to using it. If I decide to plan anything else, I'll keep you in mind. Still smiling, Noel tapped one of those crooked fingers against the side of his beak of a nose.
You don't trust me yet. That is understandable. Although if I meant you any harm, all I had to do was stand back that night in the alley. You have the look in your eye. I've seen great men laying plans, and villains dark as the pit of doom, too. There is a look a man gets laying dangerous plans he doesn't want known. My eyes are just tired, Matt laughed, leaning on his staff. Great men laying plans. The old fellow had probably seen them in Shibuya with the giants. I do thank you for that alley, you know. If there's ever anything more I can do for you, ask. But right now, I'm going to find a hot bath. Does this Golem drink blood?
Noel asked, catching Matt's arm as he started to hobble by. Mikey wished he had not mentioned that name where the old man could hear. He wished Brigida had never told him about the thing. Why do you ask? Golem lived on blood. They ate nothing else.
There was another man found with his throat torn out last night. Only there was almost no blood on him or his bedding. Did I mention? He was at an inn down near the Moldine Gate. If that thing did leave the city, it's back.
Glancing beyond Matt, he made a low, elaborate bow to someone.
If you change your mind, I'm always ready,
he said in a lower voice when he straightened. Matt looked over his shoulder as the old man hurried off. Tuan was standing beneath one of the gilded stand lamps, watching him through her veil. Looking at him, at least. Glancing. As always, the moment he saw her, she turned away and glided off down the hall, her pleated white skirts rustling faintly. There was no one with her today. For the second time that day, Matt shivered. Pity the girl had not gone with Suroth and Talon. A man given a loaf should not complain that a few crumbs were missing, but Aes Sedai and Seanchan, Golem stalking him and old men poking their noses in, and skinny girls staring at him was enough to give any man the gollywogs. Maybe he should forget about wasting time soaking his leg. He felt better once he had sent Lopen to fetch the rest of his own clothes from Beslin's toy cupboard, and Nerem to find Julian. His leg still hurt like fire, and wobbled when he wanted to walk, but if he was not going to waste time, then he might as well get a move on about it. He wanted to be gone from Abu Dar before Tylan came back, and that gave him 10 days, less to be on the safe side. When the thief catcher stuck his head in at the bedroom door, Matt was studying himself in Tylan's tall stand mirror. The red garments were tucked away in the wardrobe with the rest of the gauds she had given him. Maybe Tylan's next pretty could get some use of them. The coat he had put on was the plainest he owned, a fine woven blue wool without a thread of embroidery. The sort of coat a man could be proud to wear, without having everybody stare at him. A decent coat. Maybe a little lace, he muttered, fingering the neck of his shirt. Just a little. It really was a very plain coat, come to think. Almost sober. "I don't know anything about lace," Julian said. "Is that why you wanted me?" "No, of course not. What are you grinning at?" The fellow was not just grinning. His smile nearly split his dark face in two. "I am happy, that's all. Suroth is gone, and I am happy. If you don't want to ask me about lace, what do you want?" Blood and bloody ashes. The woman he was interested in must be one of Suroth's stock of ale. One she had left behind. He certainly had no other reason to care whether she was gone, much less be happy over it. And the man wanted to take one of her property. Well, maybe that was not so much, compared to taking a couple of Damani. Limping over to put an arm around Julian's shoulders, Matt walked him out into the sun. "I need a demonic dress to fit a woman about so high." He held up a hand at just about his shoulder. "And slender." He gave the fellow his most sincere smile, but Julian's own smile faded markedly. "I need 3 Suldam dresses too, and an idam." And it came to me that the man who knows best how to steal something without getting caught would be a thief catcher. "I am a thief catcher," the man growled, shaking off Matt's arm. "Not a thief." Matt let his own grin vanish. "Julian, you know the only way to take those sisters out of the city is if the guards think they're still Damani. Teslin and Edicina are wearing what they need, but we have to disguise Jolene. Suroth will be back in 10 days, Julian. If we aren't gone by then, in all likelihood your pretty will still be her property when we go." He could not help feeling that if they were not gone by then, none of them would be going. Why, a man could shiver himself to death indoors in this city. Stuffing his fists into the pockets of his dark Tyran coat, Julian glared at him. Glared through him, really, at something the thief catcher did not like. Finally, he grimaced and muttered, "It won't be easy." The days that followed were anything but easy. The serving women clucked and laughed over his new clothes. His old clothes, that was. They grinned and made wagers where he could hear over how fast he could change back when Tylan returned. Most seemed to think he would race through the halls ripping off whatever he was wearing as soon as he heard she was on her way, but he paid them no mind. Except for the part about Tylan returning. The first time a serving woman mentioned it, he nearly jumped out of his skin, thinking she actually had for some reason. A number of the women, and nearly all the men, took his change of clothing to mean he was leaving. Running away, they called it disapprovingly, and did what they could to hamper him. In their eyes, he was the ointment to soothe Tylan's aching tooth, and they did not want her to come back and bite them for losing it. If he had not made sure Lopen or Naram was always in Tylan's apartments guarding his belongings, the clothes would have vanished again, and only Vannon and the Red Arms kept Pips from disappearing out the stables. Matt tried to encourage the belief. When he went and two Damani vanished at the same time, the events were sure to be linked. But with Tylan gone, and his intention to run away at Blaine before she returned, she would be safe from blame. Every day, even when it rained, he rode Pips in circles in the stable, for a longer time every day, as if trying to build up his stamina. Which he actually was, he realized after a while. His leg and hip still ached like fury, but he began to think he could manage as much as 10 miles before needing to climb down. 8 miles, anyway. Often, if the sky was clear, Suldam were walking Damani when he exercised. The Seanchan women were aware he was not Tylen's property, but on the other hand, he heard some call him her toy. Tylen's toy, they said, as if that was his name. He was not important enough for them to learn if he had another. To them, someone was either Dr. Vale or not, and this halfway business amused them no end. He rode to the sound of Suldam laughing and tried to tell himself it was all to the good. The more people who could tell that he worked to flee before Tylen returned, the better for her. It just was not very pleasant for him. Now and then he saw Aes Sedai faces among the Damani being walked, 3 besides Teslan, but he had not a clue what Edicina looked like. She could have been the short, pale woman who reminded him of Moraine, or the tall one with silvery golden hair, or the slender black-haired woman. Gliding along beside a Suldam, any of them might have been taking a walk on her own, if not for the gleaming collar around her neck and the leash tying her to the Suldam's wrist. Teslan herself looked increasingly grim every time he saw her, staring fixedly straight ahead. Every time there seemed to be more determination on her face, and something that might have been panic, too. He began to worry about her, and her impatience. He wanted to reassure Teslan. He did not need those old memories to tell him that determination combined with panic could get people killed, but they confirmed it. He wanted to reassure her, only he dared not go near the kennels in the attic again. Tuon continued to be there when he turned around, looking at him or glancing or whatever she was doing, just too often for comfort. Not enough to make him think she was following him. Why would she do that? Just too often. Occasionally, her Sojin Selucia was with her, and now and then Anath, though the strange tall woman seemed to vanish from the palace after a time, at least from the hallways. She was on retreat, he heard, whatever that was supposed to mean, and he only wished she had taken Tuon with her. He doubted the girl would believe he was taking sweets to a windfinder a second time. Maybe she still wanted to buy him? If that was the case, he still could not understand why. He had never been able to understand what attracted women to a man. They seemed to go pop-eyed over the most ordinary-looking fellows, but he knew he was no beauty, no matter what Tylen said. Women lied to get a man into bed, and they lied worse once they had him there. In any case, Tuon was a minor irritant, a fly on his ear, no more than that. It took more than chattering women or staring girls to make him sweat. Absent as she was, however, Tylen did. If she came back and caught him preparing to leave, she might change her mind about selling. She was a high lady herself now, after all, and he was sure she would shave her head to a crest before much longer. A proper Seanchan high-blood, and who knew what she would do then? Tylen caused a little sweat, but there was more than enough else to drench a man in it. He continued to hear from Noel about the Golem's murders, and sometimes from Tom. There was a fresh one every night, though no one but those two and him seemed to connect the killings. Matt kept to open places as much as he could, with people around as often as possible. He stopped sleeping in Tylen's bed and never spent 2 nights running in the same place. If that meant a night in a stable loft, well, he had slept in haylofts before, although he did not recall hay sticking through his clothes quite that sharply. Still, better stuck by hay than having his throat torn out. He had sought out Tom straight away after he decided to try freeing Teslan, and had found him in the kitchens chatting with the cooks over a honey-glazed chicken. Tom got on well with cooks, as he did with farmers and merchants and nobles. He had a way of getting on with everyone, did Tom Merrilin, a way of hearing everyone's gossip and fitting it together to make a picture. He could look at things from a slant and see what others missed. As soon as he finished the chicken, Tom had come up with the only way to get the Aes Sedai past the guards. The whole thing had almost seemed easy then, for a very short while, but other obstacles arose. Juilin possessed the same sort of twisty way of looking at things, perhaps from his years as thief-catcher, and some nights Matt met with him and Tom in the tiny room the 2 men shared in the servants' quarters to try planning how to overcome those obstacles. Those were what really made Matt sweat. At the first of those meetings, the night Tylen left, Beslan barged in looking for Tom, so he said. Unfortunately, he had listened at the door first, hearing enough that he could not be foisted off with the story. Very unfortunately, he wanted to take part. He even told them just how to do it. An uprising, he said, squatting on the three-legged stool between the two narrow beds. A washstand with a chipped white pitcher and bowl and no mirror finished crowding the room. Julian sat on the edge of one bed in his shirt sleeves, his face unreadable, and Tom was stretched out on the other, examining his knuckles with a frown. That left Matt to lean against the door to keep anyone else from barging in. He did not know whether to laugh or cry. Plainly, Tom had known about this madness all along. This was what he had been trying to cool down. The people will rise when I give the word, Veslin went on. My friends and I have talked to men all over the city. They are ready to fight. Sighing, Matt eased his weight more onto his good leg. He suspected that when Veslin gave the word, he and his friends would rise alone. Most people were more willing to talk about fighting than to do it, especially against soldiers. Veslin. In Gleeman's tales, grooms with pitchforks and bakers with cobblestones defeat armies because they want to be free. Tom snorted so hard his long white mustaches stirred. Matt ignored him. In real life, the grooms and the bakers get killed. I know good soldiers when I see them, and the Seanchan are very good. If we free the Damani along with the Aes Sedai, they will fight beside us, Veslin insisted. There must be 200 or more Damani up in the attic, Veslin. Most of them are Seanchan. Free them, and like as not, every last one will run to find a Suldam. Like we couldn't even trust all the women who aren't Seanchan. Matt held up a hand to forestall Veslin's protest. We have no way to find out which we can trust and no time to. And if we did, we'd have to kill the rest. I'm not up to killing a woman whose only crime is that she's on a leash. Are you? Veslin looked away, but his jaw was set. He was not giving up. Whether we free any Damani or not, Matt went on, if the people rise up, the Seanchan will turn Abu Dar into a slaughter yard. They put down rebellions hard, Veslin. Very hard. We could kill every Damani in the attic, and they would bring in more from the camps. Your mother will come back to find rubble inside the walls and your head stuck up outside them. Or hers will soon join it. You don't think they'll believe she did not know what her own son was planning, do you? Light. Did she? The woman was brave enough to try it. He did not think she was stupid enough, but... She says we are mice, Veslin said bitterly. When wolfhounds pass by, mice lie quiet or get eaten, he quoted. I don't like being a mouse, Matt. Matt breathed a little more easily. Better a live mouse than a dead one, Veslin. Which might not have been the most diplomatic way to put it. Veslin grimaced at him, but it was true. He encouraged Veslin to join the meetings, if just to keep a rein on him, but Veslin seldom came, and it fell to Tom to try to cool the man's ardor when and as he could. The most he could persuade Veslin to promise was that he could not call for the rising until the rest of them had been gone a month to let them get clear. That was something settled, if not satisfactorily. Everything else seemed to take 2 steps and hit a stone wall, or a tripwire. Julian's lady love had quite a hold on him. For her, he seemed to not mind doffing his tyrant clothes for a servant's green and white livery, or missing sleep to spend 2 nights sweeping the floor not far from the stairs that led up to the kennels. No one looked twice at a servant pushing a broom, not even the other servants. The Tarasin Palace had enough of those that they did not all know one another, and if they saw a man in livery with a broom, they assumed he was supposed to be using it. Julian spent 2 whole days sweeping, too. Finally reported that Suldam inspected the kennels first thing in the morning and just after dark, and might be in or out at any time of the day between. But at night, the Damani were left to themselves. I overheard a Suldam say she was glad she wasn't out in the camps where... Lying stretched out on his thin mattress, Julian paused to yawn copiously behind his hand. Tom was sitting on the edge of his bed, which left the stool for Matt. It was better than standing, if not by much. Most people would be asleep at that hour. Where she'd have to stand guard some nights, the thief catcher continued when he could speak again.
Said she liked being able to let the Damani sleep all night, too. So they were all fresh come sunrise. So, we must move at night, Tom murmured, fingering his long white mustache. There was no need to add that anything moving at night drew eyes. Seanchan patrolled the streets at night, which the civil guard never had. The guard had been amenable to bribes, too, until the Seanchan disbanded them. Now, at night, it was as likely to be the Death Watch guards in the street. Anyone who tried to bribe them might not live to face trial. Have you found an item yet, Julian? I asked. Or the dresses? Dresses can't be as difficult as an item. Julian yawned into his hand again. Oh, get them when I get them. They don't just leave Ida lying about, you know. Tom discovered that simply walking Damani through the gates was not possible. Or rather, as he freely admitted, Rezel had discovered it. It seemed that one of the high-ranking officers staying at the Wandering Woman had a singing voice she found most entertaining. One of the blood can take the money out with no questions asked, Tom said at the next meeting. This time, he and Julian both were sitting on their beds. Matt was beginning to hate that stool. Or few enough, anyway. Suldan, though, need an order signed and sealed by one of the blood, an officer who is captain or above, or a dare Suldan. The guards at the gates and on the docks have lists of every seal in the city that qualifies, so I can't just make any sort of seal and think it will be accepted. I need a copy of the right sort of order with the right sort of seal. That leaves the question of who will be Suldan. Maybe Rezel will be one, Nat suggested. She did not know what they were doing. Telling her would be Tom had asked her all sorts of questions, as if he was trying to learn about life under the Seanchan, and she had been trying to ask her Seanchan friend. But she might not be happy enough to chance her pretty head going up on a pike. She could do worse than say no. The lady loved Julian. He had a thought on the third. He asked Julian to find a Suldan dress that would fit Satala Anan, though there had been no chance to actually put it to her yet. He'd only been back to the Wandering Woman once, since Jolene had walked into the kitchen to make sure she understood he was doing all he could. She did not, but Mistress Anan had actually managed to smother the Aes Sedai's anger before she could begin shouting. She would make the perfect Suldan for Jolene. Julian shrugged uncomfortably. I had a hard enough time convincing Thera to run away with me. She is timid now. I can help her overcome that in time. I know I can. But I don't think she is up to anything like pretending to be a Suldan. Tom tugged at his mustaches. It's unlikely Rezel would leave under any circumstances. It seems she likes Banner General Lord Yamada's singing well enough that she has decided to marry him. He sighed regretfully. And there will be no more information from that well, I fear. And no more pillowing his head on her bosom, his expression said. Well, both of you think on who we can ask. Let's see if we can lay hands on a copy of those.
Hey, Story, how you doing?
Tom managed to find the proper inks and
Straight
paper.
to me
He
time.
was ready to imitate anyone's hand and seal. He was contemptuous of seals. Anyone with a turnip and a knife could copy those, he said. Writing another man's hand so the man himself would think he had written it was a but none of them were able to find a copy of orders with the necessary seal to copy. Like Idam, the Seanchan did not leave orders lying about. Julian seemed to be making no progress with the Idam either. 2 steps forward and a stone wall. 6 days were gone just like that. 4 left. To Matt, it felt as if 6 years had passed since Tyler's departure, and 4 hours remained till she came back. On the 7th day, Tom stopped Matt in the hallway as soon as he came in from his ride. Smiling as though making idle conversation, the one-time gleeman pitched his voice low. The servants hurrying past could not have heard more than a murmur. Golan killed again last night. The Seekers have been ordered to find the killer. If they have to stop eating or sleeping to do it. Though I can't find out who gave the order. Even the fact that they have been ordered to do anything seems to be a secret. They are practically readying the rack and heating their irons already, though. No matter that Tom's voice was low, Matt looked around to see whether anyone was listening. The only person inside was a stout man named Narvin in livery, but not carrying anything. Narvin did not carry or hurry. He decided Matt, trying to look every direction at once, and frowned. Matt wanted to snarl, but instead he grinned as disarmingly as he knew how, and Narvin went back. I'm sure the fellow had been responsible for the first attempt to remove Pips from the stable. I told you about the Seekers. Closely, as soon as Narvin was far enough away. Tom waved a lean hand dismissively.
Of course not. Just about the killing. Though he does seem to hear whispers and know what they mean. Their talent, that. I wonder whether he really has been to Shara, he mused. He said he...
Tom cleared his throat under Matt's glare.
Well, later for that. I don't have other resources than the much-lamented Rizal. Several of them are listeners. Listeners really do seem to hear everything.
You've been talking to listeners? Matt's voice squeaked like a rusty hinge. He thought his throat might have rusted solid.
There's nothing to it, as long as they don't know you know,
Tom chuckled.
Matt, with Sean-Chan, you have to assume they are all
Let's do
listeners.
another one at this one now.
Where you learn what you want to know without saying the wrong thing in the wrong ear.
He coughed and knuckled his mustache, not quite hiding a smile, so self-deprecating it all but inviting praise.
I just know 2 or 3 who really are. In any case, more information never hurts. You do want to be gone before time returns, don't you? You seem to be looking a little forlorn with her gone.
Matt could only groan. That night, the Golem struck again. Lopen and Mara were bubbling over with the news before Matt had finished his breakfast fish. The whole city was on the latest victim, a woman, had been discovered at the mouth of an alley. And suddenly people were talking, putting together one killing with another. There was a madman on the loose, and the people were demanding more Sean-Chan patrols on the streets at night. Matt pushed his plate away, all hunger gone. More patrols. And if that were not bad enough, Suroth might come back early if she learned of this, bringing Tylan with her. At best, he could only count on 2 more days. He thought he might lose what he'd already eaten. He spent the rest of the morning pacing, well, limping, up and down the carpet in Tylan's bedchamber, ignoring the pain in his leg while he tried to think of something, anything, that would let him carry out possible in 2 days. The pain really was less. He had given up the walking stick, pushing himself to regain strength. He thought he might manage 2 or 3 miles on foot without needing to rest the leg. Without resting it very much, anyway. At midday, Julian brought him the only really good news he had heard in an age. It was not news, exactly. It was a cloth sack containing 2 dresses wrapped around the silver length of an eidam. Chapter 29. Another plan. The beam-ceilinged basement of the Wandering Woman was large, yet it seemed
Hope you're doing good,
as the room
sorry.
Tom and Julian shared, though it held only 5 people. The oil lamp set on an upended barrel cast flickering shadows. Farther away, the basement was all shadow. The aisle between the shelves and the rough stone walls was barely wider than a barrel was tall. That was not what made it seem crowded. I asked for your help, not a noose around my neck, Julian said coldly. After near a week in Mistress Anand's care, eating Enid's cooking, the Aes Sedai no longer looked haggard. The frayed dress Matt had first seen on her was gone, replaced by high-necked fine blue wool with a touch of lace at her wrists and under her chin. In the wavering light, her face half-shadowed, she looked furious, her eyes trying to bore holes through Matt's face. If anything went awry, anything, I'd be helpless. He was having none of it. Offer to help out of the goodness of your heart? Well, sort of. And see what it got you? He practically shook the eidam under her nose. It wiggled in his hand like a long silver snake, glinting in the dim lamplight, the collar and bracelet both scraping across the stone floor. And Jolene gathered her dark skirts and stepped back to avoid being touched. It might have been a viper from the way her mouth twisted. He wondered whether it would fit her. The collar seemed larger than her slim neck. Mistress Arnon will take it off as soon as we get outside the walls, he growled. She left to hide you down here. I'm telling you, it is the only way. Jolene raised her chin stubbornly. Mistress Arnon muttered angrily under her breath. She does not want to wear the thing, Fenn said in a flat voice behind Matt. If she doesn't want to wear it, then she doesn't wear it, Blerick said in an even flatter at Fenn's side. Jolene's dark-haired warders were like peas in a pod for men so different. Fenn, with his dark tilted eyes and a chin that could chip stone, was a touch shorter than Blerick, and maybe a little heavier in the chest and shoulders, yet they could have worn each other's clothes without much difficulty. Where Fenn's straight black hair hung almost to his shoulders, blue-eyed Blerick's very short hair was slightly lighter in color. Blerick was Shinaran. He had shaved his top knot and was letting his hair grow in to avoid notice, but he did not like it. Fenn, the Saldaean, seemed not to like much except for Jolene. They both liked Jolene a lot. The pair of them talked alike, thought alike, moved alike. They wore dingy shirts and the workmen's plain woolen vests that hung down below their hips, yet anyone who took them for laborers, even was blind. By day, in the stables, where Mistress was working, they were looking at Matt as lions might look at a goat that had bared its teeth at them. He moved, so he did not have to see the warders even from the corner of his eye. The knives hidden about him in various places were a small comfort, with them at his back. If you will not listen to him, Jolene Maza, you will listen to me. Planting her hands on her hips, Satala rounded on the slender Aes Sedai, her hazel eyes glaring. I mean to see you back in the tower if I have to walk every step of the way pushing you. Perhaps along the way you will show me that you know what it means to be Aes Sedai. I'd settle for a glimpse of a grown woman. So far, all I have seen is a novice sniveling in her bed and throwing tantrums. Jolene stared at her, those big brown eyes as wide as they would go, as if she could not believe it. Matt was not sure if she believed his either. Innkeepers did not stand on the dogs' throats. And Blerick muttered something that sounded uncomplimentary. There's no need for you to go farther than beyond sight of the guards at the gates, Matt told Satala hastily, hoping to divert any explosion Jolene might be considering. Keep the hood of your cloak pulled up. Right, he had to get her one of those fancy cloaks. Well, if Julian could steal an Idam, he could steal a bloody cloak, too. I mean, I'll see another Sultan. You'll get back here before daybreak, and no one knows. Unless you insist on having a marriage night. He laughed at his own joke, but she did not. Do you think I could remember women are turned into animals because they can channel? She demanded, stalking across the floor till she stood toe-to-toe with him. Do you think I'd let my family stay? Her eyes had glared at Jolene, they'd blazed at him. Frankly, he had never considered the question. Certainly he would like to see the Damani freed, but why should it matter this much to her? Plainly it did, though. Her hand slid along the hilt of the long curved dagger, stuck behind her belt, caressing it. Abu Dari did not take kindly to insults, and she was pure Abu Dari to that extent. I began negotiating the sale of the Wandering Woman 2 days after the Seanchan arrived, when I could see what they are. I should have handed everything over to Lytle Alana days ago, but I've been holding off because Lytle would not expect to find an Aes Sedai in the basement. When you are ready to go, I can hand over the keys and go with you. Lytle is growing impatient, she said significantly over her shoulder to Jolene. And what about his gold? He wanted to ask indignantly. Would Lytle have let him take that away? A windfall under her kitchen floor? Still, it was something else that made him choke. Suddenly, he could see himself saddled with Mistress Anand's whole family, including the married sons and daughters with their children, and maybe a few aunts and uncles and cousins as well. Dozens of them. Scores, maybe. She might be from off, but her husband had relations all over the city. Blerick slapped him on the back.
I didn't find any smart home devices under Michael's account.
Blerick slapped him on the back
I
so
don't know
hard
what
that
the
he
hell
snapped.
happened there, but
He showed the fellow his teeth and hoped the Shinaran would take it for a smile of thanks. Blerick's expression never altered. Bloody warders.
okay.
Bloody Aes Sedai. Bloody innkeepers. Mistress Anan, he said carefully, the way I mean to get away from Abu Dar, there's only room for so many. He had not told her about Luca's show yet. There was a chance he could not convince the man after all. And the more people he had to convince Luca to take, the harder it would be. Come back here once we're outside the city. If you have to leave, go on one of your husband's fishing boats. I suggest you wait a few days, though. Maybe a week or so. Once the Seanchan discover Tudamani missing, they'll be all over anything trying to leave. Two? Jolene put in sharply. Teslin and who? Matt winced. He had not meant to let that slip. He had Jolene pegged, petulant, willful, and spoiled with the words that came most readily to mind. Anything at all that made her think it was more difficult, more likely to fail, might just be enough to make her decide to try some crack-brained scheme of her own. Something that would no doubt ruin his own plans. She would be captured for sure if she tried to run on her own, and she would fight. And once the Seanchan learned there had been an Aes Sedai in the city right under their noses, they would intensify the searches for Marath Damani again, increase the street patrols more than they already had for the mad killer, and worst of all, they might well make it even harder to pass the gates. Edicina Azadin, he said reluctantly. I don't know anything more about her. Edicina, Jolene said slowly. A tiny frown creased her smooth forehead. I heard that she had... Whatever she had heard, she snapped her teeth shut on it and fixed him a fierce stare. Are they holding any other sisters? If Teslin is getting free, I won't leave any other sister to them. It took an effort on Matt's part not to gape. Petulant and spoiled? He was looking at a lioness to match Blerick and Fen. Believe me, I won't leave an Aes Sedai in the kennels unless she wants to stay, he said, making his voice as wry as he could. The woman was still willful. She might insist on trying to rescue the other two like Bura. But he should never have let himself get tangled with Aes Sedai, and he did not need any ancient memories to warn him. His own would do very well, thank you. Ben poked him on the back of his left shoulder with a hard finger. Don't be so light-tongued, the warder said warningly. Blerick poked him on the back of the other shoulder. Remember who you are talking to. Jolene sniffed at his tone, but she did not probe further. Matt felt a knot loosen in the back of his neck, about where a headsman's axe would strike. Aes Sedai twisted words with other people. They did not expect others to use their own tricks on them. He turned to Satala. Mistress Anan, you can see your husband's boats are much better. It might be so, she broke in, except that Jasper sailed with all 10 of his boats and all of our kin 3 days ago. I expect the guilds will want to talk to him if he ever returns. He isn't supposed to carry passengers. They are coasting to Ilion, where they will wait for me. I don't really intend to go as far as Tarban. This time Matt could not stop a wince. He had intended falling back on Jasper Armin's fishing boats that had failed to persuade Luca. A dangerous option, true. More than dangerous. Mad, maybe. The Sultan on the docks likely would have wanted to check any order that sent Damani out on fishing boats, especially in the night. But the boats had always been in the back of his mind. Well, he was just going to have to twist Luca's arm hard. Just as hard as necessary. You let your kin go out in this season? Disbelief and scorn made Jolene's voice. When the worst storms are brewing? Her back to the Aes Sedai, Mistress Anan raised her head proudly, but it was not pride in herself. I trust Jasper to sail into the teeth of a Semaros if need be. I trust him as much as you do your warders, Green. More. Frowning suddenly, Julian took the iron post and moved it to cast light on the inside. Sometimes your voice is instead of answering, Paula took the item from the hand and fumbled at the flat segmented bracelet on one end of the round silver leash. The whole thing was made in segments, and so cunningly you could not see how it had been done. We might as well get the testing over with. Testing, he said, and those hazel eyes gave him a withering look. Not every woman can be a Suldam. You should know that by now. I have hopes that I can. But we'll find out before the last hour. Scowling at the stubbornly closed bracelet, she turned it in her hands. Do you know how to open this thing? I cannot even find where it opens. Yes, he said faintly. The only times he had talked with Seanchan about Suldam and Damani, it had been cautious questions about how they were used in battle. He had never even thought about how Suldam were chosen. He might have to fight them. Those ancient memories had him thinking about how to fight battles. He had certainly never meant to recruit them. Better to test it now, instead of... The catch was very simple for him. The bracelet easiest. That was just a matter of squeezing the right spots, top and bottom, not quite opposite the leash. It could be done with one hand, and the bracelet popped open on one with a metallic click. The collar was a little trickier and required both hands. Putting his fingers in the proper spots on either side of where the leash attached, he pressed, then twisted and pulled while holding the pressure. Nothing happened that he could see until he twisted the two sides the other way. Then they came apart right beside the leash with a sharper click than the bracelet. Simple. Of course, figuring it out had taken him nearly an hour. Back in the palace, he...
Alright, everyone. I'm going to call it into this live for tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who continues to stop by and chill with me. Definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Until next time, everyone. Y'all stay safe out there.